In 1974, Eli Lilly filed a U.S. patent for the oral oxyphenylpropylamines, a class of compounds that seemed like they'd lead to effective antidepressants. They'd still need to invest millions of dollars and years of research before they could come out with a drug based on the compound, but in the meantime, the patent would allow them to defend their invention in case another company tried to beat them to market. And from Lilly's perspective, it's a good thing they did, because the compounds protected by this patent eventually led to fluoxetine, which you might know as Prozac, a drug that brought in over $2 billion in annual revenue at its peak. This kind of patent protection is one of the most important strategies in the pharmaceutical industry and has a major impact on what kind of drugs get developed and how much they cost. But it didn't used to be this way. Up until relatively recently, almost every country in the world excluded drugs from patent protection. The United States was an important exception. So I had two research questions for this video. Number one, how did the medical community transition from opposing patents to accepting patents? And number two, how did we end up with the drug patent system that we have today? As usual, we should probably start by defining what we're talking about. In the United States, a patent grants an inventor an exclusive right to make, use, sell, and import their invention into the US for 20 years. The inventor doesn't have to do any of those things, but they can legally exclude others from doing so. Since patent holders are the only ones allowed to sell their patented product, they get a temporary monopoly on the market for that product. And this grants patent holders the ability to charge higher prices than they would be able to in a competitive market. They risk the time and money to invent a thing, and the system rewards them for it. Although, individual patents are only protected by their assigning country. So if you patent an invention in the US, it isn't automatically patented in Japan. The United States has had some kind of patent law since 1790, and while specifics have changed over the years, the main idea is that these laws are supposed to reward innovation in the short run and benefit society in the long run. For example, Seth Wheeler patented perforating toilet paper rolls in 1891 and made money off it while it was under patent protection. Then when the patent expired, TP manufacturers were able to use the design and society benefited from it. But of course, drugs are not toilet paper, and people have always held the intellectual property of medicine to a different standard. The story starts in the mid-1800s, when the popular opinion in medical circles around the world was that patents did not belong in healthcare. Period. It didn't matter if it was for a drug or a medical device. If someone made an advancement in health tech, then ethically, they should share it freely and transparently. But the legal situation looked a little different. Like, most European countries passed laws that flat out said you couldn't patent medicines. Meanwhile, some countries like Japan allowed patents on medical devices and machinery, but not medicines. And some like the UK and its colonies did allow drugs to be patented. But the United States was always a bit of an outlier. In 1849, American physicians tried to pass a law prohibiting drug patents in the States, but it never became law. It was still heavily frowned upon, but the result was that drug patenting stayed legal in the States while it was illegal in other high-income countries. Now, there were doctors and salesmen who did take out patents from the patent office, but they just kind of ignored the criticism from their peers. For example, the team who popularized ether, the first surgical anesthetic, patented the drug in the US. And even though anesthesia was the biggest advancement in surgery at that point, some American doctors still advocated against using it just on the grounds that it was patented. So, we had patented medicines, but there was also this separate category called patent medicines. In this case, patent refers to letters patent, originally granted by the English government. This was a kind of intellectual property protection, but patent medicine sellers almost never filed patents with the US Patent Office. It was more of a patent for the name on the label as opposed to the ingredient in the bottle, and their label was really all they had. Sometimes patent medicines would have useful ingredients, but oftentimes they were just alcohol and herbs. Also, they almost never revealed their formulas, and they could get away with it since there was zero regulation on these things. This is where we get the term snake oil salesman. Snake oil was the name of a famous patent medicine. Not surprisingly then, they relied heavily on marketing. Like, there was a New York patent medicine salesman that spent $100,000 a year on marketing his pills, and this was in 1849. That would be almost $4 million today. By 1900, patent medicine sellers accounted for more than half of American newspaper advertising revenue. That same year, patent medicines accounted for over 70% of drugs sold in the US. Orthodox physicians hated both patent medicine salesmen and doctors who patented medicines. They thought both groups were greedy monopolists and unscientific quacks, because if their medicine worked, then their secrecy prevented the medical community from understanding why it worked. And if it didn't work, then they were grifting gullible consumers into buying worthless products. These doctors were so opposed to secrecy and monopolies in medicine that they explicitly condemned patents in the very first Code of Ethics from the American Medical Association. It said, quote, "Derogatory to professional character is it, for a physician to hold a patent for any surgical instrument or medicine, or to dispense a secret nostrum, whether it be the composition or exclusive property of himself or of others. For if such nostrum be of real efficacy, any concealment regarding it is inconsistent with beneficence and professional liberality, and if mystery alone gives it value and importance, such craft implies either disgraceful ignorance or fraudulent avarice." The code discouraged physicians from even recommending patented medicines, really putting as much distance as possible between monopolies and medicine. The early American Pharmaceutical Association had a similar position. Their 1848 ethical code included a section saying that any useful information about drug discovery should be made publicly available for everyone to benefit from. Although, pharmacies usually sold and made money from patent medicines. And hey, I get it. You gotta pay the bills. Now, there was another group of drug makers who were dedicated to only producing drugs with explicit, known recipes. Think drugs like opium, quinine, foxglove, stuff from the early pharmacopoeia. These companies became known as ethical drug manufacturers in the literature. Ethical because they adhered to the ethical codes of the early physicians and pharmacists. These companies didn't advertise much, they tended not to invent new products, and while some of these companies did hold patents, they were usually on processes as opposed to products. But over time, these ethical manufacturers grew into our modern big pharmaceutical companies. So what happened? According to Jean-Paul Godelaire in History and Technology, the inflection point was the industrialization for the pharmaceutical industry, which for the US was after the Civil War. For obvious reasons, battlefield doctors needed drugs during the war, and the Union Army in particular created a ton of demand for ethical drugs in the North. So existing companies like ER Squibb had constant business throughout the war. Then, after the war, manufacturing across all industries expanded, and pharma manufacturing was no exception. As a result, more new ethical companies popped up, like Parke-Davis in 1866 and Eli Lilly in 1876. And there was some innovation in this space. Like, sometimes these companies would invent new and improved manufacturing processes, like making extracts or pill coating processes, and some folks came out with new and useful drugs, too. But mostly physicians and pharmacists as opposed to big companies. Now, at the same time, the ethical manufacturers were facing stiff competition from non-pharma companies that were starting to dabble in the industry, and this is when the patent conversation started to shift. Around the mid to late 19th century, two new industries crossed over into the pharma market: dye companies and chemical companies. I talked about the dye companies in the salvarsan and sulfa drugs video, which you can find here, but the condensed version is that around the middle of the 19th century, people learned that some dyes were pretty effective at getting into certain bacteria. This led scientists to design chemicals that selectively targeted germs while leaving our healthy human cells alone. And voila, antibacterial medicines. The chemical companies were a little different. See, while the pharma and chemical industries were separate things in the US, they were more tightly linked in other countries, most notably for our story, in Germany. These companies tended to treat science the same way they treated manufacturing. They brought the chemistry and microbiology in-house and built research facilities to discover new drugs. But of course, this research is expensive, so the chemical companies were some of the first to lobby for ethical patenting of drugs, regardless of what the American Medical Association said. They argued that drugs were just another industrial chemical product to commercialize and market. Now, these lobbying efforts didn't go anywhere until after World War II, but we'll get there. For the rest of the 19th century, non-American companies dominated the US ethical drug market. Since the US was one of the only countries that allowed patents on drug products, foreign companies were happy to do business in the States. According to a report in the census of 1900, non-American companies held more than 90% of the American patents in different chemical categories. This let them jack up drug prices for American consumers. Depending on the product, the same drug would cost twice as much in the US compared to Canada. And even though doctors weren't supposed to use patented products from an ethical perspective, it was hard to ignore how well these drugs worked compared to anything else. German companies introduced a bunch of effective, patented products throughout the 1880s. These included fever reducers phenazone, also known as antipyrine, in 1884, and acetanilide, also known as antifebrin, in 1886. There were also antiseptics like Aerostol in 1890, and that set a new precedent. If you wanted to make money in the medicines business, your product would need to work. And that meant to release a new drug, pharma companies would need to research them ahead of time. And that meant investing in chemistry labs and conducting at least some clinical testing. This is where the classic patent argument comes from. It takes a massive investment of time and money to come out with a single drug, and in order to recover that investment, you'd need to patent your invention. Other proponents of patents argue that, long-term, patents in this case actually advanced science. Because at least when something had a US patent, the manufacturer had to disclose what it was. The patent for aspirin even tells you how to make it in your lab. By the way, aspirin is the topic of the next video, so make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Right, so if you were an ethical drug manufacturer back then, industrialization changed everything. You only sold existing drugs, while other companies could create new drugs, take out patents, and monopolize a new market. Plus, even though it was against their code of ethics, orthodox doctors were starting to use patented drugs since some of them actually worked, which meant that your usually reliable market was starting to slip away. At first, ethical companies tried to compete by maxing out their economics. They'd build bigger factories and invent more efficient machines. But it soon became clear that if they wanted to compete with the big dogs, they'd need to revamp their entire business model and introduce new drugs. And to do that, they'd have to invest in research and development too. For example, the ethical drug maker Parke-Davis funded research trips to the West Coast and Southwest to find new medicinal plants. And as expected, this is when they started coming around to patents. They formalized their new position in an 1886 book. Quote, "We do not object to a pharmacist patenting his machinery, apparatus, or processes, believing that the patent law was designed to stimulate inventors to invent and to publish their inventions for the purpose of promoting progress in science and the arts. The patent law does not lock up knowledge, for the invention finally becomes public property." Over the next few years, Parke-Davis came out with more patented drugs, including a hormone product they called adrenaline. And while they didn't get zero pushback for it, they actually got sued for patent priority, the medical community didn't blacklist them for it. But oh boy, did the new strategy pay off for them. They made around $10 million in 1911, which grew to over $20 million in 1921. This was clearly a good financial strategy, so they kept inventing and patenting new medicines. Great, so it's the early 20th century, and now we've got some drugs that actually work. But this led to a dilemma. Doctors had equated patents with quackery for so long, and clearly that wasn't the case with some of these new drugs. And so, the ethics shifted. In 1912, after years of debate, the AMA revised their code of ethics, technically the principles of medical ethics at this point, and allowed physicians to hold patents. They still didn't think it was professional to profit from the patent, but having one wasn't prohibited anymore. And this ethical shift wasn't just happening in the US. Patent officers in France started allowing patents on physiologically active extracts since it involved isolating and purifying something novel. And in Germany, while product patents still weren't allowed, companies were starting to take out more process patents. So, big picture, by the early 20th century, the scientific and medical communities in capitalist nations had shifted from hard disapproval of drug patents to reluctantly approving their use. But still, most countries didn't allow patents on pharmaceutical products. The United States was the biggest exception to the rule. But between World War I and World War II, a handful of very important patent cases made it clear that patents would be crucial to running a pharmaceutical company. The first of these cases was the patenting of extract obtainable from the mammalian pancreas or from the related glands in fishes useful in the treatments of diabetes mellitus and a method of preparing it, which of course was insulin. Frederick Banting and his co-discoverers assigned the patent to their institution, the University of Toronto, who then licensed it to Eli Lilly in the United States. And on paper, they could justify this as ethical. Like, if an academic discovers a useful medicine, it needs to be scaled and distributed to people to do any good. But if you just let a pharma company make the drug, they might cut corners and make a crappy product, which at best could tarnish your reputation as the inventor, and at worst could, kill people. On the other hand, if the university held the patent, the money earned from royalties could go back into funding research and making new medicines. So some institutions came up with a new model. Scientists would patent their discoveries and assign the rights to their institution. Then from there, the university might license the drug to a manufacturer, which would let the inventor and the institution keep an eye on quality and their own professional brands. One of the most famous stories happened just a few years after the U of T guys came out with insulin. In 1924, Harry Steenbach at the University of Wisconsin submitted a patent for a method for exposing sterols in certain foods to UV radiation, which increased the levels of vitamin D in that food. Anti-rickettic here means anti-rickets, since rickets can be caused by vitamin D deficiency. He assigned the rights for the patent to a new nonprofit organization who then licensed it to dairy producers. And it was for the same idea I mentioned. It would keep quality of his invention high, and the royalties would help fund future research. And there were definitely critics to this model. But by the end of the 1920s, the researcher-university industry patent model was commonplace. Then when the Depression hit, it was necessary to patent drugs and collect those royalty checks so they could keep the school afloat. The second case that made it clear that patents were going to be absolutely necessary is a story of penicillin. Alexander Fleming discovered the antibacterial properties of penicillin in 1928. Then about a decade later, a research team out of Oxford University led by Howard Florey researched penicillin's role as a medicine. It took a ton of resources and time to make enough penicillin to actually save someone's life, but they figured out how to ramp up production just enough to manufacture a few doses and show that it would be an important antibiotic. Since penicillin would be such a good tool for the soldiers fighting in World War II, they needed to expand production even further. So Florey came to America and collaborated with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Now, the USDA already had some experience growing large quantities of mold, so if they meshed their work with Florey's findings on penicillin, they could potentially expand penicillin production. Working with a much bigger team, scientists at the USDA figured out new methods of making penicillin, which yielded much higher quantities than before. Then, when the US got involved in the war, the government awarded contracts to a bunch of private chemical companies for the sake of cranking up penicillin production for the war effort and for use at home. And those companies delivered. The US went from producing 425 million units of penicillin in June of 1943 to 117.5 billion units a year after, and 650 billion units the year after that. The production costs also dropped from $20 per 100,000 units to less than $1. Those contracts also happened to leave the participating pharma companies like Merck, Pfizer, and Abbott with some well-developed production facilities and R&D departments. Here's how this relates to patents. None of the British scientists patented anything about the penicillin production process, but the USDA scientists did. Now, this was totally legal. The US scientists had created new processes and could patent them. But from the UK's perspective, they wouldn't have invented those processes without the Oxford scientists. Either way, the UK Medical Research Council regretted this immensely after the fact. They'd left comically large suitcases of money on the table, and the US picked them up. It was so bad that the UK revised their patent laws in 1948. They allowed for drug patenting and gave the government rights to license them freely, like to create generic medications for use in the National Health Service hospitals. Then in 1949, they created the National Research Development Corporation, specifically to protect the intellectual property that came from research funded by the UK government. This one had more to do with computers than drugs, but still. So at this point, it's the 1950s, and attitudes towards patents are completely different than they were in 1900. This led the AMA to do a kind of spiritual reset of the ethics principles in 1955. Physicians were now fully allowed to hold patents and receive financial compensation. And 2 years later, they added that really, you didn't strictly need to adhere to the code. It was more like a set of guidelines. But it was hard to ignore that things were getting rough for the consumers. World War II and the penicillin saga transformed the American pharmaceutical industry. While there used to be hundreds of small drug makers, now only a few dozen dominated the entire scene. Big companies acquired smaller companies, revenues got bigger, and it got much more expensive for the average patient. One of the hopes was that after a drug's patent expired, different companies would start selling generic versions of that brand name drug. And while the definition of a generic drug has changed over the decades, you can think of it as the same active ingredient as a brand name drug, but sold after the patent is expired. Generics typically start out with a smaller price tag than the pioneer drug, then lead to lower prices as more generics come out. This chart from the FDA shows it pretty clearly. The first competitor enters the market cheaper than the originator, then as more generic alternatives come in, the price of the drugs in that market trends downward. So if you're a pharma exec, you have to play both defense and offense. If you have a first-in-class drug, you want to defend your monopoly position, but if you don't get there first, you also don't want to wait 20 years to compete with pioneer drugs. One of the strategies that pharma companies used, and still use, was developing drugs that were nearly identical to first-in-class drugs in their structure and how they worked, but tweaked them just enough to patent them. Like, it might have a slightly different mechanism, different efficacy, or drug-drug interactions. This kind of drug became so common that this guy, one of the authors of a famous pharmacology textbook, gave them the name Me Too drugs at a conference in 1956. They're also known as follow-on drugs. And these aren't all just cash grab situations. Sometimes multiple companies work on the same problem and just by coincidence release similar drugs at the same time. And they're not entirely a bad thing either. Like, it's good to have alternatives to a popular drug in case patients can't take the pioneer drug or if there's a drug shortage. And sometimes follow-ons have different side effects. And on the finance side, some economists argue that having multiple drugs in a class, like multiple statins or ACE inhibitors, lowers the cost of pioneer drugs even when they're still on patent. And sometimes they do offer real therapeutic value over the pioneer. For example, there are tens of millions of beta blocker prescriptions out there. It's a massive market, which made it prime for Me Too drugs. Beta blockers are drugs designed to keep heart rate and blood pressure down by blocking receptors in your cardiac muscle tissue that, among other things, can increase heart rate when stimulated. In 1962, Imperial Chemical Industries Limited filed a patent for the first popular beta blocker, propranolol, which expired in 1984. But propranolol is non-selective. It blocks multiple types of beta receptors, and some patients only want beta-1 receptors blocked. So in 1972, a different company came out with atenolol, which was more selective for beta-1 receptors and only needed to be taken once a day. Then in 1979, Merck filed a US patent for bisoprolol, which was even more selective for beta-1 receptors and didn't really affect beta-2s. And there are plenty of other beta blockers out there, but these are drugs that came out while the first in class was still under patent. So for beta blockers, some Me-Toos did offer more value, but that's not always the case. Sometimes follow-on drugs don't offer any clinical benefit beyond the originator drug, but companies develop them anyway since they'll still be able to charge high prices under their new patent. So let's get back to the story. We're in the 1960s, and it's clear that the last few decades resulted in a ton more drug options, yes, but also jacked up drug prices and a concentrated pharmaceutical industry. So, a senator from Tennessee named Estes Kefauver decided he would try to tackle it. Kefauver had already made a name for himself as an anti-monopoly guy, and all that recent corporate consolidation made pharma seem way too concentrated and powerful. So in 1959, he started a years-long investigation into the pharmaceutical industry, including 17 months of hearings with pharma execs. At the end, he concluded a few things. 1, profit ratios were way too high. And 2, the drugs on the market hadn't been tested for efficacy. They didn't know if they worked. Now, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, did exist at this point, but it only required drug manufacturers to submit safety data on their drug prior to approval. And this early FDA couldn't enforce much anyway. So on the consumer safety side, Kefauver proposed a bill that would require the FDA to actually review drugs for efficacy prior to approval and to keep an eye on claims made in drug advertising. But on the economic side, he also wanted to lower prices. So he proposed a more fundamental change to the patent incentive system. Instead of 20 years of market exclusivity, new drugs would get 3, and they'd have to grant licenses to other companies at a maximum of 8% royalties. And if there was already an approved drug in a class, any new ones in that class would need to be significantly more effective to get approved. No more patent protection for Me Too drugs. As you can imagine, not everyone loved his proposal. The AMA thought there was no way a non-expert government agency could tell whether drugs worked or not. They said, quote, "The only possible final determination as to the efficacy and ultimate use of a drug is the extensive clinical use of that drug by large numbers of the medical profession over a long period of time." Meanwhile, representatives from pharma companies big and small wrote letters to Congress critiquing the bill. And some of the critiques sound familiar in modern day. Patents incentivize research, they keep companies from stealing other companies' hard work, and they're the best solutions for products that are so research heavy. Plus, deciding that an allegedly Me Too drug worked better than a pioneer drug would be totally arbitrary. So in June of 1962, the Kennedy administration countered with a modified bill that had fewer reforms to the patent system. Kefauver didn't like this, and it seemed like the bill was dead. But then, international tragedy struck. Throughout 1962, thousands of babies around the world were affected by birth defects linked to a medication called thalidomide. Some died after a few months, and some lived the rest of their lives with serious limb deformities. But thanks to the opposition of a reviewer at the FDA named Francis Kelsey, thalidomide was never approved in the US. This close call was enough for the Kennedy administration to take another look at Kefauver's proposal. The final bill, the Kefauver-Harris Amendments to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, wasn't as sweeping as Kefauver originally wanted, but it still created some fundamental changes to the system. It required the FDA to review the safety and efficacy of new drug candidates prior to approval, and it started a retrospective review program of drugs approved between 1938 and 1962. For future drug approvals, companies would need to submit high-quality evidence with their application, which meant a greater emphasis on randomized, placebo-controlled trials. This is when the modern design of phase 1, 2, and 3 trials gets started. It also tried to incentivize the development of generic drugs by establishing a clear approval process. Generics would still have to show safety and efficacy, but instead of spending hundreds of millions of dollars on clinical trials, they could submit a, quote, paper NDA, or new drug application. These were like literature reviews showing the generic would be safe and effective. The problem with that is that the innovator companies were the ones holding on to the original research. So most innovator companies were like, no way, we're holding on to this data as long as we can. So as you can imagine, this didn't create as many generics as Kefauver had hoped for. At the end of the day, the new Kefauver-Harris requirements meant that drug development would be much more expensive for innovator pharma companies. As a result, companies pushed these new, higher costs into a new, higher price. The new requirements also made the development process last much longer, like to the point where the same compound could hit the European markets way before they came out in the States. And so, Kefauver's original intention of lowering drug prices backfired. New drugs were safer and more effective, but the fixed costs from R&D exploded as a result. And after a few years of this, it was clear that very few cheap generic drugs were actually making it to market. If you were to look at all the brand name drugs with expired patents in 1983, so the ones that were eligible for generic competition, only 35% of them had a generic competitor. One of the challenges was that companies with patents on pioneer drugs could prevent competitor companies from even studying their drug while the pioneer drug was under patent protection. There was even this big court case, Roche vs. Bolar, that said generic manufacturers couldn't perform tests on pioneer drugs within the patent window. So now the pioneer company had a monopoly for the life of the patent, plus however long it took competitors to test and approve a generic. Furthermore, generics still required prescriptions. Substitution laws weren't super common yet. These are laws that let a pharmacist fill a prescription for a brand name drug with a generic medicine. Without those laws, if a doctor wrote a prescription for a name brand drug, the pharmacist would have to fill it with that drug, even if there were a cheaper generic alternative out there. So the policy challenge was this. How can we create a system that incentivizes companies to develop new drugs, but also one that incentivizes low-cost generics to follow close behind? This is where the Hatch-Waxman Act comes in, or more formally, the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984. Its goal was to balance incentives between innovation from the brand name drug makers and low-cost substitutes from the generic manufacturers. The big updates. Generic drugs could apply for approval with an abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA. So instead of trialing a drug from scratch, or doing the impossible literature review, generics just needed to show they were bioequivalent to a reference drug. And since they saved all that money on clinical trials, they could get away with selling their drugs at more competitive prices. It also addressed the Roche vs. Bolar incident, and said that a generic company could use the brand name drug for the purpose of studying it before submitting their application. So now, the day after a pioneer patent expired, patients might be able to go to the pharmacy and buy a generic competitor. And bonus incentive, if they were the first approved generic applicant, they'd get 180 days of exclusivity. For new drugs, Hatch-Waxman retroactively extended the patent term to make up for any lost time in the FDA approval process, up to 5 years. See, typically, drug developers will file a patent sometime during preclinical testing, which is way before they know whether the drug candidate will ever come out for sale. Then they fill out an IND, or investigational new drug form, and soon after, they do clinical trials and submit a new drug application. Then after anywhere from a year to 16 months with the FDA, the application gets approved and they can finally sell their drug. So even though patent protection lasts 20 years, a company might only have a patented product to sell for a handful of years. The Hatch-Waxman Act gave the patent holders some of that time back, so their usual 20-year patent could now last longer. Finally, the Hatch-Waxman Act resulted in the Orange Book, a comprehensive list of FDA-approved drugs with a bunch of useful information, including information about patent terms and generic substitutes. For instance, if I wanted to find an alternative for brand name Prilosec, I type in its generic name, omeprazole, into the Orange Book search and find a bunch of alternatives to it. So if my doctor writes me a prescription, then the pharmacist could fill it with a generic equivalent and save me, my insurer, and the pharmacy some money. There are exceptions to this, and each state has different product substitution laws, but the general idea was to make generics more accessible. There were definitely growing pains and scandals, but the takeaway for this video is that this bill created a strong market for generic drugs in the US. As of 2022, 91% of prescriptions in the US are filled with generics. Now, there were some modifications over the years and smaller edits, but as you can imagine, this new and improved patent system still had some areas to exploit. See, I've mostly been talking about primary patents in this video, which are usually patents on the drug molecule itself. But before pharma companies get that new drug approved, they'll already have a plan for the life cycle management of the drug. According to a 2009 report from the European Commission, there are 3 main phases of the life cycle. The phase that runs from research and development through the product's release to market, the phase of market exclusivity where they have a monopoly, and the time after the patent expires when generics can come in. And during the exclusivity phase, companies use a few strategies to try to counter generics and keep their monopoly for as long as they can. Like, drug companies will oftentimes take out secondary patents. This is when they patent something else about the drug, like patents on different parts of the manufacturing process or formulation, extended release, new route of administration, all kinds of tweaks. The point is to cast a wide net in case there's anything to enforce. According to a 2009 report by that same European Commission, there are 7 secondary patents to every 1 primary patent. So bringing it back to lifecycle management, companies can effectively extend their patent protection by strategically filing for secondary patents before earlier patents expire. Some people call this evergreening. If that patent is approved, the company protects their initial investment for longer, gains more pricing power, reduces competition from generics, and gets to charge higher prices. Obviously, this is maddening from a patient's perspective because it keeps drugs expensive, but it's totally legal. And kind of like with follow-on drugs, originator companies say that secondary patents incentivize innovation. They argue that these little modifications are real-deal improvements. Plus, since they typically have a long gap between the start of the patent and the time they can actually sell something, secondary patents allow them to recoup R&D costs. I mean, I thought that was the point of primary patents, but fine. In 2023, John Green famously brought attention to Johnson & Johnson's secondary patent on a component of bedaquiline, an effective medicine against multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis. J&J's primary patent on the bedaquiline molecule was scheduled to expire in July of 2023, but they'd taken out secondary patents in dozens of low to middle income countries that would let them continue to charge monopoly prices until 2027. I'm showing the US patents on screen, but I'll link to a WHO document in the description that compiled all of them. Now, J&J had already agreed to grant certain licensing rights to a public health initiative called the Stop TB Partnership, which would make some bedaquiline available in those low-income countries. But in September of 23, they also agreed not to enforce their secondary patent in certain countries. This drove down prices and got bedaquiline to patients who otherwise wouldn't have been able to access this life-saving medication. And while that story had a happy ending, there are plenty of other ways of extending a patent. For instance, there's product hopping, which is when a brand tries to phase out their older product and introduce a newer product that's protected by a patent that expires later. This is more of a marketing tactic than anything. It's meant to train the consumer to buy the new product. Product hopping has 2 forms though. There's hard switching, where a company stops selling the older product and only sells the new one, and soft switching, where they keep selling the old version and just market the hell out of the new one. Quick example of soft switching from a few years ago. There was a company called Actavis that made a drug for dementia called Namenda IR, generic name memantine. That patent was set to expire in July of 2015, so in 2014, Actavis introduced Namenda XR, IR for immediate release, XR for extended release. They also increased the dosage from 10 milligrams on the IR to 28 milligrams on the XR, so a prescription for the new XR couldn't be filled by a generic IR. To switch people over to the new drug with the longer patent, Actavis stopped marketing the old IR version, gave discounts to patients for the XR version, then made a big push to market the XR to doctors. Unfortunately for activists, it was clear that their marketing efforts weren't going to switch that many people to the new XR version, so they tried to pull IR from the market and do a hard switch. In September of 2014, the New York Attorney General sued activists on antitrust grounds. They eventually settled and decided to keep both XR and IR on the market. Now, was there some value in a drug that dementia patients would only need to take once a day? Sure, but clearly activists was trying to get people to buy a drug with a longer patent. All right, example is done. Let's get back to the timeline. As of the 1970s, most countries still didn't allow patents on drug products. America was the biggest exception to the rule. But in the late 70s through early 90s, some high-income countries started to accept them, while low-income countries tended not to. As a result, the newly formed World Trade Organization launched the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS. As I understand the agreement, it was a way to standardize intellectual property rights between participating nations. And part of TRIPS was the rule that pharmaceutical products could be patented, something that pharma companies were very big fans of. But this was also in the middle of the AIDS crisis, and antiretrovirals like AZT were still under patent, which is a whole other infuriating story. And the worry was that low-income countries like South Africa, which had a huge disease burden with HIV, wouldn't be able to afford life-saving medication. Regardless, the agreement passed in April of 1994 and went into effect on January 1st of 1995. Low-income countries had 10 years to transition onto the new program, but would have to eventually look at patent applications filed from 1995 onwards. Meanwhile, anything marketed in their country before 1995 wouldn't be eligible for a new patent. There have also been a bunch of asterisks and smaller nation-to-nation deals that have complicated TRIPS over the years. These new standards are referred to as TRIPS Plus, like they're a subscription travel service or something. So throughout the 90s, the pharma industry kept chugging and cranked out one blockbuster drug after another. But one of the phenomena that happens with this kind of patent incentive structure is that most of a pharma company's revenue ends up coming from one drug, maybe a handful. And when that patent finally expires, generic competition reduces the innovator's sales by a lot, by like 80 or 90%. And when a bunch of patents expire at the same time, it can have a serious impact on the entire industry. This is called a patent cliff. And starting in 2010, the patents on a bunch of those blockbuster drugs from the 90s were all set to expire within a few years of each other. For example, the patent for AstraZeneca's breast cancer drug, anastrozole, trade named Arimidex, was set to expire in 2010. They made almost $2 billion in revenue from the drug in 2009, but multiple companies were ready to go with generic alternatives as soon as the patent expired. According to AstraZeneca's 2011 annual report, Arimidex sales fell 53% because of the patent expiration, which was still good enough for $756 million in revenue. This was the pattern for dozens of blockbusters, but the biggest one was atorvastatin, also known as Lipitor, in November of 2011. It's hard to calculate exactly how much revenue was lost on the patent cliff overall. Like, the sales for some individual drugs dropped by 90%, but when you add up all the lost revenue, it totaled to a significant percentage of the entire pharmaceutical industry, like many tens of billions of dollars. There were technically two waves of the patent cliff, one from 2007 to 2013, which were mainly small molecule drugs, and another from 2014 to 2020, which included more biologics. These are products made from living things, so this category includes everything from therapeutic viruses, antitoxins, blood components, monoclonal antibodies, and others. Biologics tend to be much bigger and more complex than traditional pharmaceuticals, so they're harder to develop. But since they're harder to replicate, the drugs with patents expiring during the second wave didn't see as much competition right away, and that made them expensive. Biologics represented 23% of drug spending in the US in 2011, and according to former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, while less than 2% of Americans use biologics, they represent 40% of total spending on prescription drugs as of 2018. It was clear we were going to need cheaper biologics. Now, biologics don't have generic versions. Since they're more complex than small molecules, a little variation between products is expected. So products that are interchangeable with original biologics became known as biosimilars. And in 2009, the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act outlined a process that biosimilars would go through to get approval. It was kind of like Hatch-Waxman, but for biologics. Under the new act, biosimilars would be able to apply for approval with an abbreviated application form. They'd need to show that they were similar to the original, had the same mechanism of action, treat the same condition, and use the same dosage and route of administration as an FDA-approved biologic. They'd also have to be produced in a facility that was up to code. And very similar to the incentive structure in the Hatch-Waxman Act, the first biosimilar competitor would get a full year of market exclusivity over other biosimilars. But of course, Pioneer Biologics got some incentives too. In addition to normal patent protection, the Act gave innovator companies 12 years of data exclusivity. That means that if a competitor company wanted to develop a biosimilar, they wouldn't be able to cite data from the Pioneer's clinical trials for 12 years. The goal of the Act was the same thing we've been talking about all video. Patents are supposed to reward invention in the short term, but society in the long term. So the idea was to reward companies for making truly novel biologics, but also reward companies for making less expensive biosimilars. All right, I'm making this video because my next few videos are about the biggest blockbuster drugs of all time. And in order to understand how those drugs made so much money, you need to understand how patents give companies so much pricing power. But before we're totally done with this topic, I had one more question. Do pharmaceutical patents actually incentivize innovation? There are a few ways to measure this, but to summarize, most reports I read said that the number of drug patents is increasing while the number of new drugs actually coming out is decreasing. Some authors say that these patents are coming from evergreening and more Me Too drugs. Now, I said earlier that it's hard to define what counts as a Me Too drug, but a research group publishing in 2018 tried. They analyzed tens of thousands of drugs up to 2016 and assigned them similarity scores based on their chemical structures. If drugs had very high similarity, they were more likely to be follow-on drugs. Importantly, they couldn't measure the novelty of biologics, which is a growing source of drug innovation and, as they acknowledged, a limitation of their study. Either way, the researchers concluded that drugs with very high similarity scores had doubled between 1999 and 2014. So to them, that's more patents, but fewer novel drugs. Aside from that group, some researchers measure innovation by the number of new molecular entities submitted to the FDA. And it's the same thing here. NMEs are flatlining while patents are increasing. Finally, and this is a personal take, it feels like patents incentivize the development of profitable drugs, but that's it. They don't incentivize antibiotics or for drugs that treat infectious diseases. Innovating these kinds of drugs would truly benefit society, but aren't a good financial decision for a for-profit company. Luckily, some folks have proposed a few ways of reforming the patent system. First, no more evergreening, Me Toos, or patents for little modifications. Patents should only be granted when the drug is substantially better than an existing drug. India's actually been doing this since 2005. And in her TED Talk, lawyer Priti Kristal mentions that the patent office itself may need to change. The patent office makes more money the more patents that it grants, which incentivizes them to grant more patents. It seems like the biggest theme, though, is that if a pharma company gets a new patent, they should be adding significantly more value than what existed before. That's why the Constitution has patent law in the first place, for the benefit of the people, not to protect profits in perpetuity. Before you go, if you learned something from this video, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. I'm really proud of the next few videos, which I'll put into a playlist that you can find here. And if you want to support my work and see videos early, consider signing up for my Patreon here. Thanks for watching, y'all. I'll see you next time.